Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking about what I call optimized learning. And optimized learning is very important for developing a positive psychological sustainable wellness infrastructure. And it's directly associated with positive well-being in particular. And it involves this perception-dependent learning plasticity. And learning plasticity involves a perceptual, psychological, as well as a physical or a psychophysiological process that's occurring within the mind, the body, the environment, mind, body, environment constituents, as well as mind, body, environment constituencies, and which directly, for example, influences the release and regulation of important hormones in the body, important for things like neurotransmission and improving immunity, and also directly improving upon positive well-being and supporting positive well-being, such as brain-derived-neurotrophic-factor, BDNF, and nerve growth factor that code for new proteins and help to synthesize, for example, various neurotransmitters such as serotonin, which is important for perception, motivation, action, behavior, emotions, feelings, pretty much everything we do. Dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, GABA, which is another very, very important neurotransmitter important for learning and memory, particularly things like rest and forming associations, as well as creativity, and also restoring, for example, our energy supply, our psychological energy, as well as our perceptual energy that we have access to that we can draw upon. And it's also very important for learning and memory and skill development. And optimized learning primarily involves two major components, which is perception and this perception-dependent learning plasticity, as well as various perceptual processes that within it have a meaning processing and meaningful processing, which takes us to our second component, which is that it's meaning processing, and meaningful processing that's also direct to this thoughtfulness and this thoughtful processing and cultivating thought regarding our own well-being and what relates to the self, and making these connections between the self, but within the self, the self and the surroundings that form these meaningful associations, particularly these meaningful reciprocal relations and associations that have causal and correlative influence, which impact our positive well-being overall, and which influence things like perception, motivation, emotion, feeling, actions, and behaviors, as well as cognitions that are important to developing, preserving, protecting, sustaining, and proliferating positive well-being along with optimized learning. And optimized learning directly involves various mind, body, environment constituents, as well as mind, body, environment constituencies that are involved in perception, motivation, emotions, feelings, actions, behaviors, and cognitions that are direct to things like thoughtfulness, thoughtful processing, perception, perception-dependent plasticity, perceptual processing, psychological stimulation, psychological flexibility, travel-dependent, perceptual-dependent learning plasticity, novel stimuli within the environment, environmental stimulation, physical activities, both informal and formal, as well as informal and formal exercise, mindfulness, meditation, sleep, rest, proper nutrition, food consumption, various healthy foods, our relations to those foods and the associations we make. For example, positive associations, or if we engage in things like savoring or mindful eating, this can be very beneficial to supporting both learning processes, as well as our overall positive well-being through supplying us the psychological resources we need through things that give us energy, direct energy, and primarily psychological energy that fuels things like perception and psychological processes, which is another term I'll discuss more broadly in another video. It's another term I posit, psychological energy, which refers to an energy supply that fuels things like the perceptual process and psychological process. Uh, but for the time being, I'm just going to go over what I have just discussed there and discuss it a little bit more broadly and refer to how the relationships even between those various things, perception-dependent learning plasticity, perception, meaning processing, meaningful processing, thoughtfulness, thoughtful processing, uh, psychological stimulation, psychological flexibility, travel, travel dependent learning plasticity, environmental stimulation, as well as environmental stimuli that we perceptually perceive and which engages us in a meaningful process. Environmental enrichment, and particularly associated with environmental stimulation and perception dependent learning plasticity, and that can be occurring within a novel environment or returning to an environment where you can develop more granularity through novel stimuli in that environment or perceiving the environment in a new way, in a refreshing way. That's a novel perceptual dependent process that's associated with the neurotransmission of acetylcholine, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is very important for neurotransmission and also learning, memory, and well-being overall, and it impacts our entire nervous system, as well as things like serotonin, like another neurotransmitter important. There's serotonin, which is important for things like regulating mood, regulating perceptions, motivations, emotions, feelings, actions, and behaviors, and which help us develop not just our learning apparatus, but also help us develop emotional intelligence alongside that and improve upon our perceptual, motivational, emotional, feeling based, action based, behavioral repertoires that are constituted or form these constituencies between mind, body, and environment, and have mind, body, environment constituents that are these component aspects that can be that are occurring in a process, various forms of expression, self-expressions, and embodiments, various degrees and gradations. And so optimized learning it's important to understand that when we engage in a multitude of these various perceptions, motivations, actions, emotions, feelings, and behaviors, they can actually form relations, reciprocal relations, as well as associations, and the association can have causal and correlative effect that can be mediated or moderated. So that means, so mediated, it can be the effect has a pathway of effect. There's two variables that are interconnected, and there can be a third variable that is implicated in that, in which it'll turn on an effect or increase an effect. And a moderator is, you could think of it as a dial on an effect, so it can increase or decrease an effect. As well as there's also the attenuation of an effect, and that can shut an effect on or off. And all these different factors that go into optimized learning, operating primarily through the perception-dependent plasticity, release and regulate various hormones that support neurotransmission in the body for everything that we pretty much do: perception, motivation, through perception, motivation, action, feeling, behavior, even philosophizing, psychologizing, something I engage in a lot. And these hormones that are primary to that is brain-derived-neurotrophic-factor, BDNF, and nerve growth factor that's released during this optimized learning process, and that directly impacts and fosters positive well-being. That is a major component of this positive psychological sustainable infrastructure. And so when we engage in optimized learning, we're very much cultivating a positive psychological sustainable infrastructure within the self related to these various processes, related to perception, perception dependent learning plasticity, meaning processing, meaningful processing, thoughtful processing, thoughtfulness, mindfulness, meditation, sleep, rest, proper nutrition, our relations to food, our relations to the environment, novel environment stimuli, novel environment stimulation, travel, uh, just even environmental stimuli and environmental stimulation that's meaningful and being perceived in a meaningful way, and that we engage in a thoughtful process. And again, how we form various relations and associations, if these associations and relations are particularly positive and are associated with these positive perceptions, positive motivations, positive emotions, positive feelings, positive cognitions, positive behaviors, and positive actions, this is really what's going to foster more of these greater benefit to our positive well-being, and which will ultimately increase things like our self-actualization tendencies, which will allow us to be in a better position to self-actualize, as well as cultivate a greater sense of uh, uh, positive well-being within a psychologically sustainable wellness infrastructure. And that's all I wanted to say in this video.